Welcome to Piercing the Veil. I'm Daniel Viget. The fact of our existence entails that the initial conditions and laws of the universe are such that they're life-permitting. However, there's good reason to think that of all the possible configurations of the universe, only a small subset would be such that life could come to develop. The vast majority of possible configurations of the universe, this is a quote from philosopher of science Roger White, last only a few seconds or contain no stable elements or consist of nothing but black holes. They're such that the basic preconditions for life are not met. Even without any scientific background, intuitively it does seem, this is another quote from the philosopher of science Ian Hacking, extremely improbable that a random concatenation of the forces, energies, particles, and fields of the universe, or whatever we think its building blocks are, should, in a single trial, form into anything orderly, let alone something that supports our form of intelligent life. It thus seems that our universe has been fine-tuned for life to exist. The epistemic situation we are in is analogous to the following scenario presented by White. Nuclear bombs are connected to a high-security combination lock, such that dozens of dials have to be adjusted with extreme precision to avoid detonating the bombs. Had any one dial differed ever so slightly from its actual position, the world would have been destroyed. In the absence of an explanation of why the dials were adjusted as they were, suppose they'd been spun at random, we'd find it quite astonishing that we were here to consider the matter. So there seem to be three possible ways we could respond to such a situation. The first is to say that it's a coincidence that we're here at all, that there's one universe and it happened to be one of the very small subsets of possible universes that met the conditions for us to come to exist. The second possible response is to say that our universe is fine-tuned for life. It's so highly unlikely that our universe would be suitable for life by coincidence that there must be some sort of fine-tuner, or God. As Rodney Holder says, God who deliberately set the requisite parameters to their fine-tuned values with the express intention of creating a life-permitting universe. With regards to White's nuclear bomb analogy, it would be considerably less astonishing that we are alive if we knew that the dials were not spun at random and had in fact been adjusted by someone with the specific intent of ensuring that the bombs did not detonate. Now, this episode isn't really about fine-tuning as an argument for the existence of God, but I just want to very briefly address it because while it seems appealing and is probably the best argument that's used for the existence of God, there are significant issues with it. First, there's actually some debate about the extent to which our universe really is fine-tuned for life and the degree to which the parameters, such as the ratio of protons to electrons and the expansion rate of the universe that are taken to be fine-tuned really could have been different than what they were. So the whole premise of the argument isn't as much of a given as it's taken to be. So, and the extent to which this is true is kind of an open question in cosmology. But even if it is exactly as described and the parameters really could have been anything and there is only a tiny subset that is life permitting, the real problem with fine-tuning as an argument for the existence of God is, what about the fine-tuner? If it's so unlikely that the universe is life permitting, what is the likelihood that there would exist a being that could create a universe that would be life permitting? Wouldn't this being itself need to have a creator that would fine-tune it so that it would have the ability to fine-tune the universe for life? Who fine-tuned the fine-tuner so that it could fine-tune? Of course, following this line of questioning would lead to an infinite regress, turtles all the way down, if you will. Theologians tend to brush over this question. When asked about the origins of the universe, they claim to have this great explanation over the atheists, and that's God. But it isn't really an explanation at all, since all the same questions we had about the universe, like what caused it to be the way that it is, if it didn't have an originating cause, how could it be infinite? How does it have the range of conditions that would permit life to exist? all these questions now have to be asked about God. So it's not really a better explanation at all. God does no work in answering the question, simply puts the question off to something else. There's also just the magnitude of thinking that this universe is fine-tuned specifically for our existence. This is why the discoveries that the Earth is not at the center of the universe, and that the sun and the stars don't revolve around the Earth as we used to think that they did, and the discovery that the Earth isn't 6,000 years old, were really damaging to the theological view and why the church clung to them so tightly. It would be quite bizarre if an all-powerful, all-wise being would design a universe specifically so that we would exist when we didn't come onto the scene until 13.8 billion years after its beginning. In all likelihood, will be gone well before its end, and the estimates now are that there are something like 200 billion stars in our galaxy and 200 billion galaxies in the observable universe. So we're just an utterly insignificant aspect of the universe in terms of time and space. God can set all of the rules for this universe, design it however he wants, and presumably as an all-powerful, all-wise being, he wouldn't do anything without it having some kind of purpose. In fact, it's the whole point of the teleological argument is the universe is created with purpose, and an all-powerful God could be maximally efficient. So the enormity of the time and space in this universe that has absolutely nothing to do with us seems to suggest that the universe was not designed specifically for our existence, which is what this fine-tuning teleological argument says. Really, how arrogant do we have to be to seriously consider the incomprehensibly large scale of the universe and to think that all of it was designed so that we could exist? And a related point is that God can do anything, and indeed a common theological view is that there is an afterlife beyond the physical universe. So since God can make life exist completely devoid of any restraints from the laws of physics and without any material matter at all, why would God need the precise physical constants that we have in order for life to exist? If God can permit life to exist without any physics at all, presumably he could do so in any configuration of a physical universe and do so in a way that's much more efficient than requiring 13.8 billion years of time and 200 billion galaxies of 200 billion stars. God could intervene in any universe in order to allow life to exist. So the fact that we do live in a universe with the conditions such that we could come to exist without it being necessary for a God to intervene actually supports a naturalistic worldview, not the theological one. If we found that the universe was such that it couldn't permit life, then we would have real reason to believe in there being something else, like God. But the fact that it can support life means that divine intervention isn't in fact necessary. And the final thing I'll say on this point is the fine-tuning argument for God is still a fill-in-the-gaps argument. There's a phenomenon that it's possible we don't yet have a great explanation for, so the theologians say, well, it must be God. Well, there could be a perfectly good natural explanation for it that we're still working on. And in fact, this third scenario, which the rest of this episode is going to be about, the multiple universe hypothesis, may in fact be this very explanation. And then once we have this explanation firmly established in science, we may not be there yet, but once we do, the goalpost will be moved again to the next thing we don't have a good explanation for as evidence for God, and so on and so on. So this episode really, again, isn't primarily about fine-tuning as an argument for the existence of God, but I just wanted to quickly say a few words on why the fine-tuner doesn't really help us explain the nature of the universe at all, since we would have to explain the nature of the fine-tuner, and given our significance, or insignificance rather, in the universe, there is in fact good reason to think that the universe isn't designed for our existence. But I do realize this is a somewhat brief answer, and perhaps this specific question will be a topic of a future episode where we can go into the teleological argument for the existence of God into greater depth, because it is an interesting argument, and again, in my view, it is the strongest argument there is for the existence of God, even though I don't think it's particularly strong for some of the reasons I've given. So what this episode is concerned with is the third option, and that is the multiple universe hypothesis, and that's what we're going to be discussing going forward. The thought is that the multiple universe hypothesis solves the improbable fact of our existence without putting off the question by appealing to a fine-tuner. If there's an ensemble of many different universes, each with random configurations, then it would not be so astonishing that at least one of those universes would have the very precise features that make life possible. And because we can only exist in a universe that permits life, of all the different universes, we will necessarily be in one with that very particular configuration. An analogy to the multiple universe hypothesis is as follows. If we flipped a coin 50 times, it would be extraordinarily surprising to get heads all 50 times. But if many, many coins were flipped 50 times, let's say 10 to the 100 coins to make the point clearly, then it's essentially guaranteed that at least one coin would have landed heads for all 50 flips. It's important to note that the seemingly fine-tuned nature of the universe is certainly not sufficient in itself to warrant accepting the multiple universe hypothesis, and indeed one could accept that it gives us reason to accept the multiple universe hypothesis, but then still reject the hypothesis on other grounds. Now, my understanding is that there are actually some independent reasons to accept the multiple universe hypothesis, which is also further evidenced against the fine-tuner explanation. But I'm not a cosmologist, so any explanation I would give of these observations would just be my understanding of what cosmologists have said, so I would encourage you to explore those on your own. So what's going to be at issue in these coming sections is not whether the seemingly fine-tuned nature of our universe shows that there are multiple universes, but whether the fact that there is apparent fine-tuning actually gives any reason at all for us to be drawn towards the multiple universe hypothesis. What I'm really going to make the case for in this episode is that if the multiple universe hypothesis is right, it makes the fact that our universe is life-permitting more probable. Ian Hacking and subsequently Roger White have both argued that even if the multiple universe hypothesis were true, it would not make the apparently fine-tuned nature of our universe and the fact of our existence any more probable. They claim that the intuitive appeal of the multiple universe to solve the problem is in fact based on a fallacy, which is related to the well-known gambler's fallacy, and this fallacy is named the inverse gambler's fallacy. So the gambler's fallacy has to do with a mistake about probability inferences between independent events. And to illustrate this fallacy, we can imagine two fair dice, each with 6 sides, numbered 1 through 6. The odds that in a sequence of 36 rolls that at least one roll will consist of 2 6s is approximately 2/3. Knowing this probability, having witnessed a sequence of 35 rolls without any landing and a double 6, the gambler believes that it's more probable the next roll is going to be a double 6 than it would have been had there not been the previous 35 rolls. This is, of course, a fallacy because each roll is independent. While we may be surprised that in the previous 35 rolls, none of them were a double 6, these prior rolls have nothing to do with the probability of the 36th roll being a double 6, which still has a probability of 1 in 36. Another version of the fallacy would be that after flipping a coin 5 times, having it land with tails facing up all 5 times, one expects that on the 6th flip, the coin is going to land as heads facing up. The reasoning would be that over the long haul, we would expect to see a similar number of heads as tails. So since we have already seen many tails and no heads, one comes to think that it's more likely the next flip would be heads. And again, this line of reasoning is mistaken because each flip is independent. The 6th flip still has a 1 in 2 chance of being heads, regardless of whether the first 5 flips were all heads, all tails, or some combination of the two. The gambler's fallacy thus consists in attributing different probabilities to an independent event based on outcomes of previous events. Now, in the inverse gambler's fallacy, there's still a confusion about independence. It just manifests itself in a slightly more subtle way. Hacking presents the inverse gambler's fallacy as follows. Think of a gambler coming into a room, walking to the fair device and seeing it roll double 6. A kibitzer asks, do you think this is the first roll of the evening, or have there been many rolls? The gambler reasons that since double 6 occurs seldom, there have probably been many rolls. End quote. The reasoning of the gambler is again fallacious. The gambler is attempting to use the fact that the probability of there being a double 6 roll is greater the more rolls there are to make a claim that the result of a particular roll being a double 6 is evidence that there have been multiple rolls. But the trouble is that the gambler only observed one particular roll, and the probability of that particular roll being a double 6 is independent of the number of prior rolls because it's an independent event. Had the gambler known only that a double 6 was rolled at some point during the night and not on one particular roll, then he would be justified to think that there were multiple rolls in the night. But this is not the situation that hacking describes. The gambler's trying to use the surprising result that he witnessed in one independent event to infer the existence of other events that have no bearing on the outcome of the one event that he witnessed, which is why his reasoning is fallacious. The difference between the gambler's fallacy and the inverse gambler's fallacy is thus the direction of the fallacious inference. The gambler's fallacy uses the result of prior events to make an inference about the probability of observing a particular independent event, whereas the inverse gambler's fallacy uses the result of a particular independent event to make inferences about prior events. In both cases, inferences are being made between events which are independent of one another, and thus they are both fallacious lines of reasoning. The question now is whether or not the appeal to the multiple universe hypothesis is based on a fallacy as the same type as the inverse gambler's fallacy. Hacking and White believe that it is. Hacking considers the version of the multiple universe hypothesis in which many universes have existed one after the other in a long temporal sequence. His argument rests on the assumption that the configuration of each universe is completely independent. That is, in the same way the probability of a roll of dice being 1 in 36 is the same irrespectively of any prior roll, the probability of any particular universe being life permitting is the same irrespectively of how many previous universes have been configured. As the argument goes, the fact that the particular universe we are in is life permitting is no more evidence that there have been other prior universes than the gambler witnessing one roll of double sixes is evidence for there having been multiple prior rolls. It's guilty of the inverse gambler's fallacy. In both cases, one improbable independent event has been observed, and then has been used to make inferences about other prior events that would not have influenced the probability of the improbable event that has been witnessed. White extends Hacking's argument to include the version of the multiple universe hypothesis in which many universes exist simultaneously. The key move that White makes is to claim that regardless of the temporal sequence in which multiple universes would exist, the evidence that we're trying to explain is not the fact that there is some universe which is life permitting, but that this particular universe is life permitting. When this distinction is made, White argues it is clear that the jump to multiple universes is guilty of the inverse gambler's fallacy. The fact that there are multiple existing configurations of the universe indeed raises the probability that there's some universe that is life permitting, but it does not raise the probability of any one particular universe being life permitting. This is a quote now. The events that give rise to universes are not causally related in any such way that the outcome of one renders the outcome of another more or less probable. They are like independent rolls of a die. Because in the case of coexisting universes, the universes are still taken to be causally isolated, or if there is any causal relation between them, it is not of a type that could increase the probability of this universe being life-permitting. The evidence that this universe is life-permitting is not any reason to accept either version of the multiple universe hypothesis, that it's a temporal sequence of universes or that multiple coexist together. The charge made by Hacking and White that the multiple universe hypothesis is guilty of the inverse gambler's fallacy, if correct, shows that our existence in this particular universe is equally improbable whether or not we accept that there are multiple universes. One possible response formulated by John Leslie is to accept this claim, but argue that we still have reason to accept the multiple universe hypothesis because we can make a distinction between a surprising event and an improbable event. As Leslie argues, while the multiple universe hypothesis may not make our existence in this particular universe less improbable, it does make it less surprising, and thus we still have reason to accept the multiple universe hypothesis. Now, I want to elaborate a bit on this distinction between a surprising and an improbable outcome. The initial appeal to a distinction between a surprising and an improbable event comes from one's intuition about what one would find surprising. When flipping a coin, it would be surprising to have it land as heads 10 times in a row, but it would not be surprising to get the sequence heads, heads, tails, heads, tails, 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 heads, tails, heads, even though each of these events is equally improbable. Some examples to help illustrate the distinction that White gives are, the quote now, "It's unsurprising that Jane won a lottery out of 1 billion participants, but it is surprising that Jim won 3 lotteries in a row, each with 1,000 participants, even though the probability in each case is 1 in 1 billion. It is unsurprising that a monkey types NIE 348 N space S9 semicolon, but when she types I want a banana, we are astonished." White claims that the crucial feature of surprising events seems to be that they challenge the circumstances in which they occur. In the case of the surprising events, he claims that there is an alternative but not wildly improbable hypothesis concerning the conditions in which the event took place, upon which it is much more probable. So the fact that it is surprising to flip heads 10 times in a row is because it is not wildly improbable that the coin is not a fair coin, and it's more geared towards landing on the head side. And this hypothesis would make the 10 heads outcome more probable, whereas there's no such hypothesis for the heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads sequence. And similarly, there would be a hypothesis that would make the monkey typing "I want a banana" much more likely than if the monkey was typing randomly, whereas no such hypothesis is likely to exist when the monkey types and whatever random sequence they type. Now, I don't actually agree that the existence of an alternate hypothesis that makes the occurrence of the improbable event more probable is what actually makes an event surprising. Instead, I think an event is surprising if and only if it's identified by more than one improbable feature, and these features are independent of one another. So the monkey randomly typing "I want a banana" is a surprising event because it satisfies this definition. It's identified by the improbable feature of being the one out of the very many possible sequences of characters that the monkey typed, and it's identified independently of this feature by the improbable feature that out of the very many possible sequences of characters, it's an English phrase. Now, the monkey randomly typing NIE348 and semicolon 9C is still identified by the improbable feature that it's one out of the very many possible sequences of characters that the monkey in fact typed. However, it's no longer identified by a second improbable feature that is independent of the fact that it happened to be typed. It's no longer a phrase that has any meaning for us. And we can see with more examples that this notion of surprising actually more closely matches our intuitions than the one that White gives. We can return to the coin example. As we saw, White must say that the reason that a result of 10 heads on 10 coin flips is surprising is because there's a not wildly improbable alternative hypothesis that the coin is rigged, which renders the result more probable. And on my account, what makes it a surprising event is the fact that 10 heads follows a pattern that we identify independently of it being just one sequence out of the many sequences of 10 coin flips that we happen to flip. 10 heads is a pattern that we recognize and are already cognizant of prior to the coins being flipped. So the event is identified by two independent improbable features: the fact that it was the sequence that was actually flipped, and the fact that it was a pattern that we already recognized. In contrast, the heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads sequence is not one there is any plausible, viable, alternative hypothesis of explaining, and thus on White's account, it's not a surprising event. On my account, it's also not a surprising event because the sequence is not one we identify independently of it being one out of the many possible sequences of 10 coin flips that we happen to flip. There's no other improbable feature by which we identify the event other than the fact that it was flipped, and thus it does not meet the definition of a surprising event. Now let's change the example slightly. Before we begin the 10 coin flips, I'm asked to predict the sequence of heads and tails in which the coin will land. The prediction that I make is the same sequence from the prior example: heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads. If this outcome then occurs, then surely it's a surprising event, and any basic intuition of what a surprising event is would tell us that this is surprising if I predict this sequence and then I flip it right after. On my account of what a surprising event is, this is surprising because the fact that I made the prediction means we now have two improbable independent features by which we identify the event. The fact that it is one of the many possible sequences that was actually flipped, and the fact that of the many possible sequences, it is the sequence I predicted. Although the sequence only had one improbable feature by which I identified it before my prediction, after my prediction there were two independent improbable features by which I identified it, and thus if the sequence occurred after I predicted it, it would be a surprising event, whereas if it occurred before I predicted it, it would not be. On White's account of surprising, this could not be a surprising event because there does not appear to be any plausible, viable alternative hypothesis that would explain this specific sequence of coin flips. And presumably, a regular coin couldn't plausibly be rigged to produce such a bizarre sequence. And just another example, we can consider a lottery. It would be improbable but unsurprising for me to learn that John Smith from Kansas is a lottery winner, assuming I do not identify John Smith independently of being that lucky bastard who won the lottery. But it would be surprising for me to learn that I am a lottery winner. Surely there's no plausible alternative explanation to my winning the lottery besides the fact that I just got lucky. And so on White's account, this could not be a surprising event. On my account, my winning the lottery is a surprising event because it is identified by two independent improbable features. The event is identified by the improbable feature of a specific individual winning the lottery, and the event is identified independently by the improbable feature of it being me, because I identify myself independently of being a lottery winner. John Smith winning the lottery is an event I identify by only one improbable feature, and that's a specific individual winning the lottery, since I do not identify John Smith independently of being the lottery winner. And so it's not a surprising event for me, though of course it would be for him. The existence of an alternative hypothesis is not what makes an event surprising, although it may at times correlate with surprising events. What makes an event surprising is that it meets the definition I have given, that it's identified by two independent, improbable features. Understanding what makes an event surprising in this way, we must then ask whether the fact that the universe we are in is life-permitting is surprising if there's only one universe, and not surprising if we accept the multiple universe hypothesis. And the answer is yes. Let's suppose that the multiple universe hypothesis is false, and thus that the universe we are in is the only universe that exists. The event in question is the occurrence of our life-permitting universe. This event is identified by two independent improbable features. The first improbable feature that it is identified by is the fact that it is the existent universe. Of all the possible configurations of universes that could exist, this particular configuration happened to be the one that occurred. We can thus identify the event by the improbable feature that it is the universe that actually exists. The second independent improbable feature that it is identified by is the fact that it is a life-permitting universe. Of all the possible configurations, it happens to be one that permits life. The only universe being life-permitting is thus an event that can be identified by two independent improbable features, existence and its life-permittingness. And so it meets the definition of being a surprising event. The fact that the existent universe is life-permitting is surprising. But let's consider the event of the occurrence of our life-permitting universe while accepting the multiple universe hypothesis. The event can still be identified by the improbable feature that it is life-permitting. However, it can no longer be identified by the feature that it is the configuration of the universe that exists, because there are now many existing configurations of the universe. So under the multiple universe hypothesis, there's only one improbable feature by which we can identify the event that the occurrence of our universe is life-permitting, and that is the fact that it is life-permitting. Since there's no second independent improbable feature by which we identify the event, it does not meet the definition of surprising that I've given, that there's two improbable independent features, and so it's not a surprising event. So I've made a case that there's a better way to understand what makes an event surprising than the account that White gives, and I've shown that on this understanding of surprising our universe being life-permitting is surprising if it's the only universe, but not surprising if we accept the multiple universe hypothesis. But this isn't sufficient to provide reason to accept the multiple universe hypothesis. In fact, White rejects the principle that a hypothesis rendering an event less surprising counts as a reason to accept the hypothesis. So I'm now going to try to make the case that accepting the multiple universe hypothesis not only makes our universe being life-permitting less surprising, it also makes it more probable. And because the multiple universe hypothesis makes the evidence or existence more probable, that gives us some reason to accept the hypothesis. The multiple universe hypothesis does not increase the probability of any particular universe being life-permitting, and this is what the inverse gambler's fallacy shows, but it does undisputedly increase the probability that some existent universe is life-permitting. It is a rule of logic called existential elimination that says that if something with a specific property exists, we can assign that thing a name as long as that name is not identified independently of being the thing that has that property. The idea is that if we know that some universe has the property of being life-permitting, we can give this universe a name, provided this name is not identified in some way other than it being the thing that is life-permitting. We're just giving a name to the thing that we know must exist. So let's call this name just the letter D. If we could identify D in terms of some property other than the fact that it is life-permitting, then we would be making a claim about a specific thing being life-permitting, which is not a valid inference solely on the basis that we know that something is life-permitting. So in short, we can make the inference if D being life-permitting would be an unsurprising event, because D can't be identified independently of the one improbable feature of it being life-permitting. But we can't make this inference if D being life-permitting would be a surprising event, because then there would be another way of identifying it. So since assuming D can't be identified independently of its life-permittingness, there exists a universe that is life-permitting, and D is a universe that is life-permitting are, in fact, logically equivalent statements. That is, they both entail each other. So the fact that the multiple universe hypothesis makes the claim that there exists some universe that is life-permitting more probable means that it also makes D being a life-permitting universe more probable as a rule of logic, since D is just the name we are giving to that universe that is life-permitting. Previously, I showed that our universe being life-permitting is not a surprising event if we accept the multiple universe hypothesis, because our universe is not identified independently of the feature that it is life-permitting. So our universe is actually of this form that D is. It can be just the name that we give to the universe that's life-permitting. So it follows that the multiple universe hypothesis does in fact increase the probability of our universe being life-permitting, because our universe is just the name given to the some universe that exists and has the property of being life-permitting, and thus serves the same purpose as D in the rule of existential elimination. So we can now see why White's argument that the multiple universe hypothesis does not affect the probability of our universe being life-permitting fails. White interprets the evidence of our existence to mean that this particular universe is life-permitting, and since the life-permittingness of any one universe is independent of the existence of any other universe, the multiple universe hypothesis does not change the probability of our universe being life-permitting. The implicit assumption that White's argument rests on is that this particular universe, our universe, is identified independently of its being life-permitting, in which case the logical deduction I just did would not work, because then our universe would be identified independently of the fact that it was just some universe. It was just the universe that was life-permitting, and we'd be making a claim about a specific universe, and we can't do that because we don't know anything about any specific universe. We only know that some universe has the property of being life-permitting. So the situation that White describes would look something like the following. Let us suppose that the multiple universe hypothesis holds, and that there are, say, 1 million universes, and our universe is number 423,189. If we identify universe 423,189 independently of the feature that it is life-permitting, then we asked whether it was life-permitting, and it turned out that it was. This would be surprising, and the fact that there are 999,999 other universes would make it no more probable that it turned out to be life-permitting. In fact, in this picture, to think that the existence of 999,999 other universes would make it more probable would be to commit the inverse gambler's fallacy. But this is not the situation with our universe. The mistake White makes is that he does not recognize that we do not identify our universe independently of the relevant feature. We identify it by our existence in it, and our existence in our universe is not independent of the fact that our universe is life-permitting. Our existence in our universe, in fact, entails that it's life-permitting. So we did not identify universe 423,189 and then discovered that it turned out to be life-permitting. We identified universe 423,189 precisely because it was life-permitting. If it was universe 639,583 that was life-permitting, then this would be the universe that we identified as ours, because our universe is just a name for the universe that is life-permitting, which has no independent identification. It's just like D. So the more universes there are, the more probable it is that at least one of them will be life-permitting, and by the logical rule of existential elimination, the more probable it is that we exist in whichever universe turns out to have that improbable feature, which we subsequently label our universe. The more universes there are, the more probable it is that our universe is life permitting, even though it's no more probable that any particular universe is life permitting. And a good way to illustrate the point is to consider Earth and the other planets. Earth is extremely fine-tuned for life, at least life as we know it. So it would be surprising, given the multitude of possible configurations a planet could be in, that if there were only one planet, it would be life permitting. On the one planet hypothesis, Earth being life permitting would be surprising because it would be identified by two independent improbable features: the existence of its particular configuration and its life permittingness. But since there are many planets, the existence feature can no longer identify Earth, and thus it's only identified by one improbable feature. And since it's only identified by one improbable feature, it's not surprising that Earth is life permitting. Earth is not identified independently of it being life permitting and discovered to be life permitting. It is identified precisely because it is life permitting. Earth is just the name given to the planet that happens to be life permitting. So the more planets there are, the more probable it is that we will be on one of them and label it Earth, the same way that the more universes there are, the more probable it is we will be in one of them and name it our universe. So I've tried to make the case that the multiple universe hypothesis really would increase the probability of our universe being life permitting, even though it wouldn't raise the probability of any particular universe being life permitting. And this is because the fact that the multiple universe hypothesis renders the life permittingness of our universe less surprising leads to the result that it also renders the life permittingness of our universe more probable. Now, of course, this is only one consideration as to whether or not to accept the multiple universe hypothesis. As I indicated, the contemporary view in cosmology seems to be that there are other reasons as well, but that's beyond the scope of this discussion. There's, of course, also the fine-tuner teleological argument for God that factors into this, and I briefly gave an account of why that doesn't really work as an explanation. But again, that wasn't the main focus of this discussion. So thank you very much for checking out this episode of Piercing the Veil. If you enjoyed the discussion, please subscribe. And episodes are available on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. I look forward to the next one.